have to hit record and then you have to agree to recording it.
Ah, okay.
How do we agree?
Okay, Cheney.
No, first of all, I have to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Cheney. I actually was a lawyer. I went to Monash. I did arts law at the very same place, well, that you're remotely being educated. But I never really wanted to be a lawyer, and I really wanted to be a fashion designer, run my own business, which is what I did, and I loved it. And actually, I longed to do it again one day in my future. But when I stopped running that business and I got inspired by education and didn't know that I would be an English educator, but then I accidentally ended up being one. And it reignited the love I had for literature when I was a student, when I was at university. And I haven't looked back, but I think there are a lot of things that are positive about the windy road I've taken. And there are things also that make it much harder. And also being a mother of 3 girls at the moment with what's going on in the world, I have found myself acutely sensitive to the situation that my students are in. And some days I end up feeling incredibly emotionally drained because I can, even though they're not showing their faces, most of them on their cameras, which I wish they would, it's like I can't tell because I can't see them, but I'm imagining what they're going through because I know what my daughters are going through. And because of that knowledge, it's helped me in many ways, but I think it's also crippled me because I'm so worried about what they're going through. And I'm so worried about pushing them. And I can't read how they're doing, not really. And I end up being quite drained. And I think that this teaching profession, I know people talk about burnout. I know I've worked really, really hard in my 7 years as a teacher, but this is the first time that I've felt emotionally that it's burning me out.
Thanks, Cheney.
That's
Madeline?
how I'm feeling this week.
That's how you're feeling this week. Madeline, what about you? You've got an interesting story as well. All 3 of you do.
Yeah, so I'm Madeline, and I've worked in education for a long time, but I came late to being a classroom teacher. I started out, just fell into working for a educational think tank in the early 90s in Los Angeles, and was just really inspired by the teachers and the thinkers that I met through in that context. And then we moved to Australia and I had little kids. So I taught in a community house and loved teaching in a community house. I loved that idea that whoever came in the door, everything stopped and we would look after that person, whatever their needs were, whether it was somebody who wanted to sign up to study a second language or whether it was somebody who didn't have a home who needed to have a shower and a meal. So I really appreciated that experience. And so as soon as my children were old enough, I went to Monash, so that was 2005, and I've been teaching secondary school ever since and absolutely love it. I was a head of English at a different school for over a decade and decided to have a bit of a break this year in 2020 and have a change of pace. And so I'd been working as a head of English in an Anglican school, and then because 2020 has turned everything on its head, here I am heading into being head of English at an Anglican school again. So that's, I don't know how windy my path has been right now, but it's certainly an interesting one. I love teaching. I can't imagine not teaching. I think about other ways I'd like to supplement what I do in terms of looking at academic work and public policy and just improving access to literacy to as many people as possible.
Thanks, Maddie. And Joe, you've got another interesting story too.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the fact that I think I tell this story differently every time I tell it. I'm not quite sure where it's going to start this time, but it seems to be starting somewhere else. I think the first teaching I ever did was teaching pretty young as a sort of teen. I taught just Spanish students coming over to Ireland, working as a foreign language teacher, helping out in kind of language schools. I don't know that I was even paid for it. I don't think I was. If I was, it was very little, but it was was a way to meet people. And then years later, I traveled overseas, and teaching was a way to travel. I ended up teaching in Thailand, again, working in teaching as a foreign language or teaching English as a foreign language. Taught in a range of everything from universities to, I worked with the police, teaching them English. I worked with the people who, customs and excise officials on the border between Thailand and Myanmar. I worked with, that was great. They moved all the lessons to the local pub and insisted on bringing whiskey to every class, feeding me, which was, yeah, anyway, digression. And then I ended up meeting my partner, and we moved to Vietnam, and I worked there as a teacher. I taught in New Zealand, and there I started working with international students, but also with people on migrant visas. And then when I came to Australia, I worked, I'm trying to think of the organization now, at TAFE, the Migrant Language Services. I can't remember the name of the organization.
AMS, maybe? AMS,
yeah, that was it. Worked for them, and then just sort of gradually found that I kind of liked teaching. I'd never really intended to be a teacher, but just sort of I kept on ending up in these sort of teaching roles. I'd drift away from it and then come back to it, and thought, well, you know, I should do it properly. I should, you know, get some sort of teaching qualification. So that's how I ended up at Monash, and did the course there with you, Scott. And then I went straight into a job, and I've been there 8 years ever since. So 8 years working in high school education, which is not where I imagined I would end up at all. Yeah, I like learning, I like teaching, and I like working with students who are intent on learning, and even sometimes those students who aren't intent on learning.
You guys are all at the same school. Perhaps it's worth talking a little bit about that context, and about the way you guys work together, the faculty, and the way that's sort of shaping your focus towards your work.
Hard to know, Joe, where to begin, isn't it? Because Joe and I have worked together since I started, which was a year after Joe, but the school thought of an idea that maybe the head of English can be a job that two people do. There'd be a head of English 11-12, so senior English, and then a 7 to 10. But I think the reason why it's worked quite well for Joe and I think we complement each other in our skills and also our interests, but I also think we genuinely get along and we listen to each other, and we're quite different teachers, but I think philosophically we're incredibly aligned. And there is absolutely no way, and I'll be honest, and this, you can keep this in the tape, I wouldn't still be at that school if Joe hadn't been there. I think you just need one person in a school, and that goes out to all of you that are watching. If you have one person that you trust, if you have one person that you look at the way that they work, the values that they have about education, the kind of person they are in terms of their integrity, you just need one. And you know, and that was enough to keep me there. And I think in terms of the way that we operate, we talk a lot about everything. So you saw from the difficulty in actually even just making a time for this appointment, there is a lot of respect for each other, not wanting to load each other up, but also willing to take anything on. There's an understanding that that other person will always have your back. And I think that, and also we're happy to talk about anything at any time, but if we feel like the boundaries are coming into our life too much, we can say that. So I think that it is, and I'm finding it hard to articulate it, it's just as much about us as people and the way that we work, and we would work in any job, as much as it is about the way that we work in an English department. I think what we also realize is that we're both dreamers, and now Madeline has come in to the fold as well. You've got to be a dreamer, and you've got to want to do new things and make change, but you've also got to be realistic that so often you're going to come up against obstacles all the time. And so you look at those obstacles and you don't go, obstacles, I knew you were coming. What are we going to do about you? Give it a go. But just because something like we had an idea for a unit that we wanted to get up and running next year, it's not going to happen, but we'll try again. I don't know if that answered the question, but I think it's an attitude.
Well, no, it's really useful. I guess what we would be keen to hear more about is what it means to be a head of English or run an English faculty, to be involved in that kind of work. Like you've talked about the relationship dimensions, your motivations. Are there other dimensions that are sort of arise in your thinking when you're thinking about your work as a head of English? What kinds of things are on your mind? What kinds of things are you thinking about?
Last year, when Joe and Cheney became joint heads of English, they asked me if I would just, we'd have coffee periodically and we'd talk about running a faculty. And so our first conversations were about nuts and bolts. Like, they were just the nuts and bolts of running a faculty. There's the admin. There's a lot of admin. There's a lot of paperwork. You have to remember a lot and keep on top of it all. The special thing about English is that it's the only faculty that teaches every single student in a school every single semester. So, and then with that added pressure, high stakes at the end, that it's the only mandatory subject for year 12. So there's a lot to keep sort of organized. And it does require a lot of organizational, a lot of logistical thinking and planning. But I think what I found as head of English is that despite some of the paperwork, it is still a very intellectual, creative enterprise. And I think that how you bring the creativity and the intellectual energy into it is through these professional partnerships, is through the trust and the respect. And even when people put up walls or there are obstacles, it can be frustrating. But if it's handled with respect and with care, and listening and some patience, those obstacles can lead to, all right, well, we're maybe not going to do that, but here's what we can do over here. Well, it doesn't mean that everything comes to a stop, but you do sometimes have to find creative solutions, because it isn't just a matter, it shouldn't just be a matter of reproducing, well, we've always done this, we've always done this, we've always done this, but actually of growing the subject. And I love that part of it. I love being part of that process of growing the subject.
So you're describing a pretty complicated set of balancing acts there. You've got a sort of practical, day-to-day, logistical, person-related, kind of getting the stuff done, a sort of strategic kind of mind. You're thinking, okay, where do we go from here? What's the school doing? Broader educational issues, but then there's a sort of creative, intellectual component where you're working with your colleagues to find solutions to longer term problems, to think creatively, intellectually about the sort of stuff you're offering. How do you manage to do all that? Like, it's a pretty tall order. You have to be a superhuman. I mean, you've talked about collaborating, and clearly that's part of how you manage that. Are there any other things that have made that possible for you to do?
Joe, for us this year, we forget things sometimes. And then
I'm surprised.
and having multiple people, kind of with
we remind each other.
Responsibility is definitely, in some ways, it's an advantage, because I'll remember things that Cheney's forgotten and Cheney will remember things that I've forgotten. But then also with that kind of distributed responsibility model, you sometimes run into, well, who was supposed to organize that? I thought you were doing that. So in answer to your question, possibly it's not done all that well occasionally.
There are times where you don't think you're doing that well at all, but I think that sometimes when you've got a lot that you have to juggle, you have to realize that there are some things you're not going to do as well as you would like to do them in an ideal world. And you have to be realistic, I think. I'm not saying that, I mean, you certainly never get a chance to slacken off. It's never like that. But sometimes you get 80% there, and that's the way it has to be, I think. There's also challenges, I was just going to say, in terms of being the middle person between school management and your team.
Yeah.
And there are times where I know I've had a difficult situation this year where the school management had a particular view about a staff member that I didn't agree with, but I had to, as the line manager, I had to go through a process with that person. And that was very challenging for me. And I had to really, that was something that I wasn't satisfied doing 80%. I didn't realize that was part of my job. And that was hard. And I had to find a way that I could satisfy what my obligations were in my role to the management, but at the same time, hold on to my integrity in the kind of professional I am and treat that person with respect. That is difficult when you're caught in the middle. And also sometimes you have to give directives. I'm doing that. Directives to your team that you don't actually see the point of the directive. And so you have to do it in a way that you show them that you understand that it's difficult for them, but you're still showing respect to management, and you don't want to get in trouble. You also don't want your team to think that you think it's a good idea, because it's evidently not.
Can we ask a nuts and bolts question, which is, as a team, the three of you, how do you sit down and work out things like the year that, like, and that what year 7 to 12 looks like for the students at your school in English? Like, are there conversations there around like what the intellectual work there, as well as the logistical work that Madeline was talking about, where you're thinking, well, as students move through English in our school, what kinds of experiences are we giving them? I mean, what are those conversations like, and how do you go about them?
In terms of the nuts and bolts of it, I don't think we ever find time for that stuff, Shani, and correct me if I'm wrong. We don't ever find time for that in the normal course of events. We have done it, and we asked Madeline to do it with us last year, where we met in holidays.
We had to do it in the holidays.
So we've had to do it in holidays. We've had to do it on weekends. We've you know, you and I have had conversations, you know, 9 o'clock at night, where I'll randomly call you when you're out walking the dog, you know, and we'll try and fit in those conversations around our lives, because I mean, 2020 is obviously a bit of an exception in that it has made everything more difficult. But even just in the ordinary day of sort of balancing parenting and teaching, it is very difficult to find time for those. The other point that I'd like to raise there is that we've occasionally had those conversations and then gone away having had those conversations and realized on occasion that, you know, well, we've had that conversation among ourselves, but we haven't necessarily had that conversation with everybody in the faculty. So we might sort of have a conversation and make some decisions, but then it's not just about us. You then need to go away and have that conversation with a whole range of other people who maybe haven't had the other conversations that you've had, who maybe haven't been part of those discussions, who don't have, I think, the same overview. Not that, you know, we have some sort of an elevated position whereby we're able to see better than others what's going on.
It's an iterative process. And it's a lot of back and forth. But I know sometimes just scheduling those conversations, even across the year, saying like, you know, term 1, blue sky, text, things that need to be different. But it actually, every, you know, you almost start thinking 2 to 3 years ahead, because it actually takes that long to have those conversations and to give people the opportunity to think things through and to make really decent propositions for texts and units of study, and to sometimes to persuade people that it's a good idea, so that it's not seen as, oh my God, this is unprofessional, but that this is actually brilliant. So it takes time.
And a lot of that is about taking time to listen to your team. So if there is someone or members of the team that are resistant, they've got their reasons for being resistant. Like we've got to, like, I mean, if somebody's been teaching for 30 years and teaching the same thing for 30 years, we can be all like, oh my God, how can someone do that? That is just, you know, the world has changed and they've got to get with the program and acknowledge the different literacies of their students. But if you actually think about it from that person's perspective, there's a lot of reason why they keep doing the same thing again and again. And I think it's part of our job to actually listen to them and talk to them, have a conversation about what we think might be a good idea, but not try and sort of kind of revamp everything in one go. It's like, Madeline, what you're saying about just kind of almost like baby steps and trying things out and supporting them in that. When people feel that their professional practice is under attack, I think that it goes to that place. I mean, they're fearful, people get angry, and then that can be an obstacle that you can never get past. I think that's something I've learned a lot this year in the conversations I've had.
I think we also need to keep in mind that we're in a process, and this is possibly particular to our school, but probably relevant to a number of schools as well, but that we're in a process of simultaneously instituting new learning management systems with an online portal where we're getting rid of the old school portal that was there previously. We've just brought in a new one which got a trial by fire when everybody had to start suddenly using it when the school closed, and at the same time considering or starting to think through what changes to the reporting system will look like, which we need to think about now. As you said, Madeline, things need to be thought about sort of 2 to 3 years in advance. The changes to the reporting system are probably 2 years away, but we need to think about how we're changing what we're teaching now and what we're doing now, so that when the time comes to have those discussions around what the new reporting system should look like, we've got some sort of idea of what we're doing and what we want to report on when we're asked about, you know, well, how would you report on this? Because what we're teaching and how we're teaching it will to some extent should play into the sorts of reporting that we do, and the sorts of reporting that we do should in theory reflect the things that we teach in our classrooms. So that kind of back and forth between those processes at a time when everything is in flux is it's a bit too tricky for my head someday. But yeah, it does, as you say, require thinking through.
It strikes me that that move, I'm just wanting to recall, well, maybe all of us, like when we were first playing around with the idea of being an English teacher, maybe before a university course or any university course, you begin by thinking about the class or the class period as a sort of unit of time, right? And sometimes it's a panic. You know, how do I fill up 50 minutes with a bunch of United kids staring at me, wondering, you know, what do I want to do? Now, you're talking, though, about, and all of you, in fact, talking about a perspective where you're thinking way beyond that, where you're thinking about learning and design for learning, curriculum work, school policy, at the sort of, Madeline, you've used the word cycle across a year. Joe, you're talking about multiple years. So that kind of perspective is a big change from going from this really focused period of time to this much longer cycle. How do you sustain a sort of a vision over that longer period of time? But how do you sort of manage things in between? Like when you're stuck in a difficult week or a difficult term, thinking about, well, you know, how do I sort of project myself into the future? Any insights about that?
Sometimes for me, before it was being part of a faculty leadership team, so actually working with other heads of faculty in other areas, that when things felt really tough, I would go and rely on the support of those colleagues. So looking at things not just in terms of an English perspective, but across the curriculum, and maybe what the school's goals were for that year. Sometimes that helps. Sometimes it's part of having those conversations at the end of the academic year and the beginning of the academic year with the faculty as a group, and finding out what they think and what they think is important, and settling on some sort of, I hate the word goals, but just, whether it's this year we just really wish we could talk a lot about analytical writing, or this year we wish we could talk a lot about poetry, or this year we're really worried about the way that standardized tests might be affecting just those kinds of, I need a term here, but the sort of areas for focus.
Yeah.
Helps,
So
rather than trying to have sort of 25 or 30 different areas of focus.
I think, and Madeline, you're very much talking about that for our year next year for 2021, and that's something that we haven't been able to do that. I feel like we've been jumping from one thing to the next, almost like just reacting rather than planning ahead. So reacting to what the biggest issue is at the time, and then jumping from one to the next. And you're right, Scott, if you work in that way, maybe you have that sort of temporary reprieve that you think, oh yeah, well, that's looking a bit better this week. But long term, you're just going crazy. You're not really moving forward, just like jumping on the spot or going, like a hamster wheel. So I think that, and Madeline, you really brought that into our department, just having dividing department meetings into briefing and discussion. So the things that are just, bits of information you have to share with your team, doesn't involve a lot of discussion, put that first. And then there's a discussion topic. And that idea that you had, Madeline, of planning the year ahead of the types of topics that we're going to discuss and giving people notice. I can see how that's going to make a huge difference for our school. In reality, I feel like there are these days where you start to become really excited about a vision for the future, and time after time, not that much kind of happens.
Well, the challenge sometimes is that the day after you've got a 6 or 7 on period day, right? And the rest of the week you're getting smashed by.
Yeah, and everybody has that.
Yeah, like the concerns that are right in front of your face. So it seems to me that what you're saying is that longer term perspective is really enabled when you focus on important questions or issues, things that can give you some longer term focus. It's something beyond the everyday. I mean, they're still connected to the things you do in the everyday, but they give you a sense of the broader motivations.
I think it can be hard to sustain the enthusiasm for that when you make plans and you put effort into things and you work towards goals, and then you see it fall apart. And it can be extremely disheartening that you've put energy into building something and planning something, and
so especially something that you've been told would be a good idea to plan.
Yeah, absolutely. But it may be kind of just how things are for one reason or another, or it may be just the circumstances that you find yourself in. I mean, we're talking in some respects about kind of geopolitical shifts in numbers of international students around the world. As an independent school that takes students from overseas, from China, our student numbers, the number of international students who come to the school, is somewhat at the whim of currency fluctuations and relations between the Australian government and the Chinese government, things which are wildly out of our control, and sometimes plans may fall apart for that reason. Whether we're going to have an EAL class at year 10 from one year to the next, there's no way of knowing. We may have it, we may not. The best thing in those circumstances to do is to go back to your goals, go back to having something to look forward to, and whether that be a text that you're hoping to introduce, or a unit that you're planning, something that you hope to get some enjoyment from, that you hope others will get some enjoyment from, something that you hope will make things better in some way, that you always keep one of those things in your mind for when Friday afternoon and it's windy and everybody's tired and they've been staring at a screen for 8 hours does go astray, and you've got to have something to hold on to.
In terms of faculty leadership, like, and I realize this conversation is, we're talking to students who are just starting out, but, who knows, some people end up leading faculties very, very shortly after leaving Monash. So, but I think those, what Joe's alluding to there as well is it's a good lesson that when, say, management of a school asks you as a head of faculty to do something and you put a lot of effort into it, and then all of a sudden it's as if that work just disappeared into some dark hole. It is very frustrating, emotionally frustrating and professionally frustrating. But it's also a good reminder, about faculty leadership, about not asking people to do things that maybe won't, that will come to nothing. Avoiding busy work, avoiding work for the sake of work, which is why, like with meetings, if it's just going to be a briefing, do we really need a meeting? Or actually, are we going to meet? Are we actually going to meet and hear each other and think about things and question things so that people feel that they have a voice, and then therefore they feel like their contributions contribute, their actual contributions, they're not just noise.
I'm mindful of time. Is there a favourite text that you've had a lot of success with this year, or a highlight that you'd like to share with students, or even advice for students starting, because we've got a few or many graduating at the end of this year and going into their profession?
I don't know. I did something with my Year 9 World of Writing class. It was in first term before we were meant to have a festival for this unit, but we couldn't do it because that's when the first lockdown happened. It's a class where it's sort of like an intro to literature and a lot of creative writing. And I adapted, I can't remember who the author was that wrote the book. I'm so sorry, I have to look it up, but called The Poetry Pharmacy. And the idea was that they had to research a number of poems. I think I made them research at least a dozen, and that to read the poem, they need to analyze the poem. They had, we did that together first. They knew what to do, and then think about what ailment or what emotion or what difficulty it might soothe and why. And so they had to revert back to the language to back their argument up. And then they had to, and they also had to write one as well as part of it. And then the idea was that they would pick their favourites, and we would have a festival where the rest of the Year 9s would come around. People would have little tents and teepees and bean bags, and you'd go up to one of the little stations and say, I've got couch potato syndrome. I can't get off the couch. And then say, I have a poem for you. And then the person would lie down, sit down, and then the organisers of the tent would read to them. And so it was on a whim that I decided to do it. I heard about this book and I just thought, why not? Let's just do it. And I'd never seen a class of Year 9 girls work so quietly, but not in a busy work way, in the zone way. And it's a tragedy that we didn't get, not really a tragedy, but it's disappointing that we didn't get to do the festival.
That's a good one.
Yeah, well, I love the idea. The Poetry Pharmacy.
The Poetry Pharmacy.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I really enjoyed teaching Let Them Eat Chaos this year. Kate Tempest's book of poetry / album. We did have a couple of really interesting conversations around the students didn't necessarily notice that it was an album, and then they'd read the book of poetry and it obviously hadn't worked for them as a book of poetry printed on the page. And then when we were discussing the pieces in class, I said, okay, can you just review it before we have this conversation? And they opened the book and I said, well, why don't you put on the song? And they were like, what? song? What's the song? So no, get it on Spotify. Yeah, just get the album. You can. It's an album. They're like, it's an album. It's an album. It's an album. Right. So that was really interesting. It did. Now this isn't quite what you asked, but it did throw up an interesting point, which I was slightly confronted by. KTEP has changed their name this year. I identified as non-binary, and it threw up a question around the extent to which I was willing to police students' language in the classroom. We had some students who would not or could not make the switch with pronouns, and I had a student in the classroom who really wanted people to make that effort and wanted me to enforce that, and I absolutely was willing to, happy to use the pronouns myself, but I was a bit confronted by the charge that I should be responsible for policing or dictating other people's language in the classroom, and I honestly still haven't worked out what I'm going to do with that one. But I think it's on the spot, on the page, as something that we need to talk about in classrooms. That was my experience with that text this year.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
I always love teaching poetry. Joe and Cheney know this. I'm passionate about poetry. I don't think that there's enough in the curriculum. I think that teachers and students alike very often will claim that it's hard, but it's really not. It's actually can open a door into love of language and creativity. And so I always think there should be more and more poetry in the curriculum. And so this year for literature, we had Emily Dickinson, and Fleur and Scott, I had an earlier conversation with you this year where I was talking about how I didn't realize that when I put Emily Dickinson's poetry on the list that it was the perfect poet for lockdown. And we were all shut-ins in our home, and so there were opportunities for students to write poetry based on what we could see out of our windows. And like Emily Dickinson, we took to writing on scraps of paper, so the back of envelopes and receipts and things like that. So I really enjoyed that experience. And then more recently, we've been reading Sylvia Plath, and something I enjoy doing with students there is writing group poems in the style of Sylvia Plath. And we had a good time doing that this year as well. It's actually a very good revision activity they are writing analytically, but it's actually wonderful to step back and say, okay, what makes a poem a Plath poem that's unlike any other poem? What gives it that voice? And then watching students it's pastiche work, but then also watching them develop their own poetry out of that. So that's a passion of mine. I am not ashamed of that passion. I keep on pushing it unabashedly.
We've all nominated poetry as our favorite text.
We have.
Yeah. That wasn't planned. I'll just reaffirm here.
Yeah.
Well, we're very happy to hear it. It's very inspiring to talk with you guys on a Friday afternoon after a long and exhausting week, and we really appreciate your time and your generosity in sharing your views and opening up your classrooms and your professional lives to us. It's a really wonderful insight into the dedicated work of three, I think, inspiring professionals, people that we're very, very gratified to have in our friendship groups and circles.
Very much so.
Yeah, is there anything else you wanted to do, Fleur, or should we let these folks get on with their afternoon?
I'm happy to stop here, but I also wanted to thank you so much and there's so much higher level thinking, and for students, I think, who will possibly be heads of English quite soon in some places, it's really good for them to have that insight into the practices of being a head of English.